symposia on the experience of Islamic movements and governance today, as we are going to, as we spoke in the morning, and we will continue tomorrow and after tomorrow about Al-Nahda movement in Tunisia. The second session, it will be about the policies and performance. And there will be another session tomorrow under the same title. We have three speakers.
الأستاذ نور الدين العرباوي.
The first will be Mr. Nuruddin Al-Arabawi, and the second is Mr. Mohsen Sudani, and the third is Mr. Rida Saidi.
الأستاذ نور الدين العرباوي هو رئيس
Mr. Nuruddin Al-Arabawi is the head of the political bureau of Al-Nahda movement. He's graduated from the Tunisian University, and he has a university degree in psychology, and he works in the, he started working in the Disabled Association, and he was detained in 1990 under the Nizam, the regime of Zainuddin bin Ali against Al-Nahda movement, and he remained in prison until 2008, and since 2012 he is a member of the Al-Nahda and the head of the political bureau since 2015, and he is representative of Al-Nahda in the current parliament. He had different courses, including a course in the National Defense Institute, and he is member of the National Islamic Congress, and he issued two books. One is the Education and Liberation in Tunisia, and the other one is about Bourguiba in Tunisia. Mr. Nuruddin is going to speak about the movement and the old regime and the political alliances of the movement. The second paper, under the title "The Democratic Action and the Popularist Challenge" for Mr. Mohsen Al-Sudani. Mr. Sudani has a PhD in philosophy or a PhD in sociology from Tunisia University in 2020, and he has also a PhD in the sociology and politics, and he has another dissertation of PhD about the interpretation in the thought of Zamakhshari and Ibn Ashur. He is a researcher in the socio-economic Center for Research and Studies in the University of Tunisia, and he was a lecturer in a number of universities and institutes for several years. In the revolution from 2014 to 2019, he was a member of the parliament, and he was member of the committees of international foreign relations, defense, and economic relations. He had several courses, including ones in the Institute of National Defense in Tunisia, and he has a deep experience in the general social communication, and he had different courses about the supervision of democracy and the role of the army and the protection of women. The third paper will be about the national challenge for Mr. Rida Saidi. Mr. Rida Saidi has a degree in engineering from the National Association of Engineers, and he has also a master's in the quality of production. Now he is working for a pro consult in Tunisia as a senior researcher, and he evaluates the private companies and they provide feasibility studies. From 2016 to 2019, he was member of the government of Sayyid Shahid as a consultant, as advisor to the prime minister, specialized in the major projects, and he was supervising the national body for monitoring public projects, is specifically the project on the phosphor acid production, which was a major project in Tunisia. Between 2011 and 2014, he was a minister in the government for the Ministry of Social and Economic Affairs, and he was supervising all the projects that are related to socio-economic projects. And Mr. Rida Saidi was one of the leaders of Al-Nahda movement during the revolution, and before that he was assigned to a number of tasks, including the planning and the studies office within the movement. He is also an advisor to major groups in the think tanks and research centers, and he has a book under the title "The Tunisian Economy: The Prospects and the Challenges," and he provides a number of the about the economy in Tunisia, and he is writing another book about the economics and the politics in Tunisia. Afterwards, we will have two comments by two commentators. The first one will be by Mr. Idris Sabouh. Mr. Idris Rabouh has a license in uh, legal sciences from a Tunisian university, and he also has a license in medicine from the University of Constantine. He has wide experience, both professional and in the public sphere organizations, and he was also a leader and is still in the in a Shura Council of the movement in the peace movement, and as well in the students groups and expertise. He is working in the Afro-Asian platform for cooperation in Istanbul. The last comment will be by Ms. Jauhara Atis from the Higher Institute of Languages in Qurtaj University. She is a professor in the Higher Institute in Tunisia in the University of Qurtaj, and she is responsible for the translation and the linguistics. And she is a professor in English literature, and she was also an independent activist student, and she conducted a lot of activities within for the public sphere within the groups of the students, and then until 2020 she was the executive office of Al Nahda movement. Welcome all, and we will start with the first intervention by Dr. Nuruddin Al-Arbawi about the movement, the old regime, and the political alliances for 25 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the SIGA for paying attention to the Islamic movements in the past 10 years, the 10 years of successes and failures. I would like to thank you for your attention to the experience of Al-Nahda movement, and I see important names that can provide the important facts, because we need, as we are having this academic exercise, we need to have the minimum level of objectivity to talk about the details of matters in order to have the complete picture of this experience that we want to understand and build on this experience, trying to avoid the failures and mistakes in the future. I was asked, and I was glad to be asked, to speak about the Al-Nahda movement, its relation with the old regime, and its political alliances. Of course, this is a topic that requires some level of details that is present in the paper that I sent to you. And hopefully, in this brief introduction, I'm going to, or presentation, I will tell you about our relation with the old regime and the movement and what we have achieved in our political alliances, which was uh, the core of the national of the past 10 years, and a little bit before that. And we have a lot of points or a lot of issues in terms of the nature and the performance that we have during the years of revolution and after the revolution. And we, some of the colleagues spoke about the popularist movement and issues related to that that affected our experience. So, in terms of our relation with the old regime or the former regime, we have sub headlines. The first sub headline is the tolerant revolution, the time of uh, militarization of revolutions, because we need to take into the consideration the context of the dynamics of political work in Tunisia and the revolution. And of course, we are with a focus on the alliances and the relation of the Al-Nahda with the old regime. The tolerant revolution and the surprising revolution when it took place, and when all the political parties were preoccupied in a free political activity, they were all surprised with the present of the revolution. It was tolerant not only in terms of the nature or the number of the martyrs who have fallen in comparison, of course, with other revolutions of the Arab Spring, but in specific in terms of the mechanism where the revolution moved from its momentum to the democratic process and aspect that we all call the democratic transition. This process was tolerant a lot because the political forces at that time started from the constitution as their terms of reference, and that was very important because it was the main relationship between the main force that represented the old or the former regime, which were uh, in direct relation with the head, which is Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, but who escaped the country, but the entire body was still there, and they all understood the necessity of the transition of power after the revolution. So that made the Tunisian revolution, and we remember that when it was the 14th of January 2011, it won. But the system at large was related to the old regime from the date of the fall of the Ben Ali until the 24th of December, when the power was still in the hands of the people of the old regime. And I'm not going to say the revolutionary powers, but the new powers didn't receive the power until the end of the year. So we spent about an entire year where the power was still in the hands of the former regime. This is a very important factor that we need to take into consideration in order to understand later that the old regime was not only an objective fact that it is there, but it was acting from behind the scene. So it was an active actor uh, on the forefront and from behind the scene. The second issue is related to the outputs of the political outputs of the Tunisian revolution. When we are saying that the old regime was still there and it didn't have to hide without any fear, or despite the fear that some of the members of the regime felt, but the regime was still there in power, in control. But when we speak about the political outputs of the revolution, because the revolution with its alliances, and here we are going to speak, we continue speaking about the old regime and how effective it was, and the alliances, political alliances of it. So the remaining of the old regime will have a lot of impact in the coming stage when we have different rounds of elections at the end of 2011 and afterwards. But in October 2011, the country had a new or started to see a new political class that participated in the elections, including like Al Nahda movement. And we have, for example, the Congress for the Republic with Al Marzouqi, and the gathering party was under the leadership of Al Jafari. So the elections there, and what I called it in the paper, the realities and the powers or the electoral realities, it imposed itself to the options that were available. The political options or choices were realistic, and what I call the electoral realities. It was in the first phase for 3 years, but it faced a lot of obstacles that made this period almost in complete hindrance after 1.5 year. But this period gave Al Nahda movement a real margin to start their relations and political relations with the new forces, and its experience, which came with the Troika, which included Al Nahda and the Congress Party and the Gathering Party, both which were new political players. So Al-Nahda movement started to materialize its vision for the state after the revolution, starting with alliance or cooperation with other forces. So for 1.5 year, the Al-Nahda movement was actually in power, but that's it. In October 2011, the new government, or the elections were in October 11, but they actually received power 1 week before the end of 2011. So they got governed in 2012 and the first quarter of 2013. But then the movement, the Al-Nahda movement was targeted fiercely, and the other powers in Tunisia started to make political assassination and to shed blood, especially after the world and the region has witnessed the coup in Egypt. So we are talking about an experience of governance and alliances that include the new political powers in Tunisia that rose or that has risen after the revolution. So the Nahda movement governed for a year and a half till the mid 2013, and afterwards there was a large movement, and the National uh, Assembly, Electoral Assembly was closed, and I believe everybody knows what happened later. So this experience lasted for 1 year and a half, actually. Afterwards, we started to see the balance of powers changing, and it seems that the old regime, whose head only fled the country in the 14th of January 2011, and this regime continued in power. And the party that would lead this former regime, the party of Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, which is it was the party that brought together all the powers that were against Al-Nahda and against the revolution and democracy at large, because it was the umbrella that had a lot of powers, and nothing brings them together other than the situation that we have started to see after the revolution. After the revolution, we started to see an Islamic movement having the popularity in the country, and that was a nice thing, and other parties were excluded and they wanted to be against that party. So in the elections of 2014 and in 2011 and 2014, because these two stations or these two moments showed the size of the new forces and the size of the old forces. The elections allowed in the Al-Nahda movement for the first period in the governance from 2011 to the mid 2013 to deal with other groups, with other actors. The new forces, although they were the ones against Al-Nahda movement. However, they were weak forces because Al-Nahda movement had 86 seats in the parliament in 2011, in the Constituent Assembly, sorry, in 2011. And then the forces that came with it, the Congress party, it had 29 seats, and the other party had 21 seats only. So for the results of these three forces, the troika, and these are what I call the electoral realities. The other two parties, the gathering and the Congress, uh, in 2014, the gathering didn't have any seats in the parliament, and the Congress took only 4 seats. So the changes that happened enabled Al-Nahda movement to get into an alliance, to get according to the benefits of, or the good for Tunisia, and afterwards they had to deal with, or the electoral realities made Al-Nahda movement deal with the powers that will come as a result of the ballot boxes. The party of Nida Tunis, or Tunisia Call, in 2014 came first, so it allowed the Al-Nahda movement to have natural relations. And when I mean natural relations, I'm talking about new forces or revolutionary forces after the revolution that came to power. The regime that wasn't eliminated in the 14th of January 2011, and maybe because of the momentum of the revolution in the elections of 2011, put them under the pressure to hide away or to step back. But this former regime regrouped itself, restored its powers under Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, and we can objectively say that it won victory against Al-Nahda in the elections of 2014. The results always, when we are talking about the results, we are talking about that we are dealing with the political forces that are present and not the ones that we like to deal with. So if those forces were not present or they were defeated in the elections, so we have to deal with forces that are present or that came out of the ballot box. Then we have a major aspect, which is the character of or the personality of Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, because at the peak of the crisis in 2013, we were unfortunately in Tunisia, we were under bloody attacks to topple the experience, and the opposition moved from the halls of the Constituent Assembly to the street. At that moment, or under that momentum, the Constituent Assembly was surrounded, and the head of the assembly selected to close it down, and it became a paralyzed institution. So in August, there was a meeting. It was very well known, and maybe we need to research the consequences of that meeting. It was the Paris meeting, and afterwards there were two things within the same entity, which is Nidat Tunis, the project of Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, and the forces that were against Al-Nahda movement. But it was dealing under the sense of democracy, because Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi was a democratic person, and that was uh, uh, And after his death in 2019, Nida Tunis party disappeared, and we started to see only the extremists, and even more than that, the fascists. And today we have a representative who is the only one of the old regime, maybe, which is the Free Constitutional Party led by Abir Morsi. So the political crisis that was going on in 2013, we started to see Al-Baji Qaid Sibsi and his party, Nida Tunis, and he has his own project. He was able to bring together the political forces who belong in most to the old regime, and I detailed in the paper a little bit about those forces and the left, especially the opportunistic left, was part of that groups, because and it is part of the old regime, and it is the part of the extremist side or wing of the former regime. Those who belong to the constitutional party that was established by Bourguiba, and it was closed down by Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, there is some there they have a sense of democracy, and the Constituent Assembly contained people from those parties. So the uh, the former regime was represented in the that Tunis, but it was led by his own character, which has some kind of democracy, and that was translated in the Paris meeting, but the political translation on the ground happened in the consensus and the meeting on the ground, because it was there was this kind of alliance. This is the second alliance between the Al-Nahda movement. Al-Nahda movement in this time made alliance with the former regime, with a leadership that had and democratic spirit. But behind this democratic spirit, there there was a deeper, a stronger a spirit, which was an exclusionist spirit. And when Al-Baji Qaid Sibsi died, Nida Tunis disappeared altogether. The experience was built on the electoral reality that Al-Nahda movement and its alliance after the elections of 2014, it's made alliance with the political forces that uh, came victorious from the ballot boxes. And some forces after 2011, they disappeared, and the people didn't give them any seats in the parliament. And the largest chair was for Nida Tunis, and Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, because of the personality of Al-Baji himself. And Al-Baji led this period from alliance with the Nahda movement, and he was calling that period as coexistence. So he was keen to call it a coexistence with Al-Nahda, but there was actually an alliance between Tunis and Al-Nahda movement. However, because of some difficulties related to the components of Nida Tunis, and here I'm talking out of experience, there were several attempts to make this alliance an institutional alliance that goes deep between the two parties, but the leftist people who were plenty in Nida Tunis behind Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi didn't want to make that alliance to the structures between the two parties or to any institutional level, and this alliance was only between Rashid al-Ghanouchi and Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi. There were some results, of course, from this experience. There was stability, but that stability, the only guarantor of this stability were the two sheikhs. And here we mean Rashid al-Ghanouchi and Al-Baji Qadi Sibsi. However, below those two people, these two heads of those two parties, the head of the state and the head of another movement, there was no alliance. and that led later to the disintegration of this alliance completely after the death of al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi. And we need to speak here that Al-Nahda movement had its own project to be a part and a leader of a new governance for the post-revolution Tunisia, and it achieved some level of that after the revolution. But later, there was the realism in dealing with the political scene, which made Al-Nahda movement coexist or make alliance with the main political forces that resulted from the elections of 2014. And of course, the main title was between that alliance was between the two sheikhs, as I mentioned. Another point that I wanted to highlight in the paper, and it is detailed to some extent in the paper, and hopefully in other opportunities we can speak about that in details, which is the experience of the secular, religious, or Islamic alliance. We have 5 minutes left only, Doctor. Okay. So this experience of the secular Islamic alliance is important from two aspects. The first one is the benefiting from other experiences, especially the Egyptian one, because in the revolutions of other Arab countries, we only saw civil war like Libya, Yemen, and Syria. So we here we can compare up between our experience and the experience of Egypt. The only year that they lived in democracy. In Egypt, there was an Islamic alliance, and we know, so to speak, and we know the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood and the An-Nur party in Egypt. For us in Tunisia, we wanted to survive in this experience, and in order to survive, we need to recognize the realities that are related to the elites, not only the elites that were governing now or before the revolution, but also the Tunisian elite that governed Tunisia since the independence, at least, or we can go even back more than the time of independence. But for the past 70 years, the secular force was the one that was democratic, and it was feeding the minds of the Tunisians about secularism in everything. And those of Tunisia who were not ideologically secular, they are secular in their behavior or in their performance. So this is one other reality, which is the elite of the secular groups. So we said that the presence of the secular powers in Tunisia is a real presence, and we need to deal with it. And the Islamic experience, which was experienced in Egypt, it incited everyone against the experience, and that was one of the reasons of the failure. Maybe if the Egyptians did something different, the results would have been different. So in Tunisia, through the secular Islamic alliance, we wanted to have an advanced experience, but however, because of the weakness of these secular groups, and when I say secular, I mean the wide definition of them, including leftist groups. But there were a lot of difficulties in different moments since the elections in 2011, in legislative elections or the presidential elections. So the secular groups, especially the left, in all of these election events led to major losses, and even most of these secular groups disappeared altogether, and that didn't allow this alliance or this experience to continue. Although we considered it to be very important for the reason that I have provided, that the secular groups maybe doesn't is not deeply rooted in this society, but their experience in this state and in their relations and the network of relations internally and internationally. So we are talking about a group that has international relations. So this elite, of course, was filled by its lack of popularity. But as we are trying to evaluate, we are saying that. But our experience to deal with the former regime and creating political alliances, in part, it was built on this idea, which is building an alliance to lead or to administer the Tunisian state. And because of the lack of time, I will try to be brief. I will summarize what I wanted to speak about the experience in general. The experience of Al Nahda movement with the old regime started from the realities uh, that we boycotted this regime after the momentum of the revolution in the first period, but it was inevitable to deal with this former regime after 2013, when the new forces that came after the revolution started to disappear and diminish, and some of the components and some of the main figures of that former regime started to rise again. So we dealt realistically with them, and we did not abandon the option of building a modern state. However, the electoral realities pushed us to start a new political experience and to deal with the old regime, especially that in the period of Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, may he rest in peace, and in we were trying to continue the democratic action, and I believe that Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, personally, out of my experience, he was the tree of democracy that was hiding a group of exclusionists. And when this tree was cut off, or when he died, the faces of those exclusionists appeared, and the democratic experience of Tunisia and the democratic transition started to see all of these setbacks that we are seeing now, leading to this killing, bloody popularist movement that is leading the Tunisians to a new presidency, and from a party that calls itself the constitutional, but it is a fascist, popularist party, and it seems that it is part of an international movement in the world. This popularist movement was not only in Syria, in Tunisia, it is coming from different countries, including old, well-established democracies like the United States and some Western European states. And unfortunately, we are suffering from this popularist movement. And this experience now is inheriting an experience that needs to be evaluated. We are not giving a final judgment, but we are talking about our dealings with the former regime, that we dealt with the realities that were present at the time. Of course, there were mistakes, and I believe there is an experience for, or there is an opportunity for observers from outside to give opinion and to provide us with their remarks. Of course, this experience is rich with the achievements that was made, and we can in the future learn from this experience, because the alliance, the secular Islamic alliance, is an experience that we can learn from uh, for uh, for the future opportunities. That's all from my side. Thank you very much for this invitation and for giving me the opportunity to speak about the experience in the past 10 years. Thank you very much, Dr. Mr. Nuruddin Al Arbawi. He spoke about the importance of evaluating, learning the lessons, and trying to avoid them. He said that the topic was about the relation with the old regime, the political alliances, and how we can learn from that. That was the core of the first 10 years after the revolution in Tunisia. He said that the revolution in the beginning it was tolerant at the time of militarization of revolutions, and he said that we need to understand the dynamics of the political action in Tunisia. He said that the political forces in the beginning started from the constitution at its starting point, and although the head was cut off of the older regime, but the body was still there. And when the power moved to the new revolution, this power remained in these forces, or the old regime remained in power till the end of 2011, which means the revolution was there, but the new forces were only received the power after in October or December 2011. During that time, the power was still in the hands of the old regime, and it was an active player. There were political outposts of the Tunisian revolution, which are that the former regime was the one that controlled or administered the country. And after the first revolution, or after the first elections, there were new rising forces that included that can govern, including Al Nahda movement with 86 seats, the gathering for the Congress for the Republic of Al Musaf al Marzouqi, 29 seats, and 21 seats for the gathering party. And they started, this led to what he called the electoral realities. And there was a margin for Al Nahda to deal with other revolutionary forces and with those two groups, and they governed for 1 year and a half under the Troika governance till mid 2013, around the end of the Egyptian experience in July 2013. Afterwards, there was a bloody deviation by the counter-revolution forces through the political assassinations and trying to eliminate the revolutionary forces and trying to copy the coup model or paradigm in Egypt. Afterwards, there was new forces in the powers that was an umbrella for the former regime, which is Nidat Tunis party under the leadership of Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi. Then there were electoral moments that showed the weight of the old regime and the new forces, and there was a complete imbalance in the new elections. The rising forces that were with the revolution, with the Nada in the beginning, got only 4 seats for the Congress party and 0 seats for the gathering party, and that was the new electoral reality that came from the ballot boxes. And Al-Nahda came second after Nida Tunisia party, which means the old regime became in power and in control after the elections in 2014. So the logic said that we need to deal with the powers that are present and not the ones that we want to deal with. There is another fact that says that Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi was a democratic person, and he was the tree of democracy that was hiding a forest of exclusionists or tyrants. And when the Al-Nahda movement was under attack in 2013, uh, they met with him. Maybe there were some differences, but with this spirit of democracy, they managed to avoid these differences, and they brought together some different groups, including the left, which represented the former regime forces. But the spirit of democracy that Asipsi enjoyed brought some kind of alliances about issues like state and democracy. But after his death, this alliance was dissolved, and Tunisia dragged into the current situation. The reality or other realities is that the new forces they vanished politically, apart of other than or apart from the uh, Nahda movement, and that was inevitable for the Nahda to make alliance with Nida Tunis. There were fears, but what they were planning or seeking to have is to have an institutional alliance. However, some of the leadership in Tunisia were rejecting that, and there was it was an alliance between Al Ghanouchi and Al Sibsi, and this alliance failed after the death of Al Sibsi. He also spoke about the Islamic Secular Alliance, and he said the importance of that is learning about the Egyptian experience in the summer of 2013. At that time, uh, that experience led to an Islamic alliance, which turned out to be catastrophic. So we believe that the continuation of the Tunisian experience was to deal with the uh, elites who governed Tunisia for 70 years, even before the independence, which is secular, and these secular forces were deeply rooted in the state, and we needed to deal with this reality other than avoiding it. There were some failures, but he didn't speak about these failures. Those secular forces led to great electoral losses, but this didn't continue because these secular forces, with their network of relations, was stronger. He said that the experience of the Nahda with the older regime and with the secular forces were built on realism in the first period, grouping together or bringing together the revolutionary forces was important, and then when we with the electoral realities was inevitable for the Al Nahda movement to deal with the former regime, especially with a Sipsi period, which was under having a margin of democratic work and building institutions. There were setbacks that led to bloody killing, populist movement to undermine the experience under the constitutional party, which is a fascist, exclusionist, populist movement. Finally, that we need to admit our mistakes for the future, and this experience was rich in terms of achievements and rich in the lessons that we can learn for the future, especially the alliance between the Islam and the secular forces. The second, now we move to the second paper under Dr. Mohsen al-Sudani under the democratic work and the popularist rising movements. 25 minutes for you, sir. Go ahead, please. In the name of God, I would like to thank SIGA for this invitation. This is a very important occasion, and I'm glad to be speaking in this work. Thank you for your organization, and thank you for the opportunity again. My paper is about the democratic experience and the popularist challenge. A number of remarks, introductory remarks before I start. All the democratic experiences in the usually are distinguished with a number of characteristics, and this doesn't apply to Tunisia alone. These characteristics that can be summarized with the vulnerability, hesitance, and finding not being well planned and looking for alliances. All of the democratic transition or states in democratic transition come into these points. In addition to that, in the Tunisian experience, we have two main factors. The first one is the surprising factor of the revolution of Tunisia, because nobody thought that a revolution will erupt. And the second one, the lack of the unified leadership. All of these factors together, which is the Histon's uh, and all the other points, and the lack of the unified leadership and the surprising nature made Tunisia to, or democracy in Tunisia, to be hindered and to reach a deadlock economically and politically. And when we review the past 10 years, without getting into a lot of details, whether in the political partisan work or the parliamentarian work, I can say that we survived from a collapse that could have happened in the in the first moment, because we were not or no factors allowed us to continue for the 10 years. The general outcomes can be summarized in two factors. First of all, a political success that is weak. The second one, economic and development failure to a large extent. After this general introduction, I can speak about the reasons of the rise of the popularist movements. In 1799, 10 years after the French Revolution, Samuel Coleridge, the poet, he is an English poet. He wrote to his friend William Roosevelt a letter. I will read the following part of it. He said, I want you to write a poem for those who abandoned the work because of the failure of the French Revolution, of any future for the humanity, and with an apocratic selfishness, hiding them under smooth titles of family bonds and dreamy hopes. This part from the letter represents the situation in Tunisia, which means after 10 years of the French Revolution, and if we draw that or project that on the Tunisian experience, it shows that people are in a state of hopelessness and disappointment because of what they see of disparities and the huge gap between the expectations and the ambitions on the one hand, and the results and the achievements on the other. At large, or by and large, this gap will be an entry point for the popularist movement, and an entry point for the relapse of people and withdrawal, where people started to accept whatever happens and submit to the reality. So at that point, we start to see the setbacks, coups, and the people might go back to the time that was before the revolution. All of these dangers or risks can be seen in all of the countries that, or all the revolutions in the world. This letter that was sent by Samuel, the poet, to his friend William Roosevelt, both who were English poets, it shows or explains a little bit the situation in Tunisia. Although this text is from 1799, 10 years after the French Revolution. In addition to that, taken into consideration this the gap between the expectations and what can be achieved on the ground after the revolutions in all of the Arab Spring worlds, we can see some of the statistics and figures in the Tunisian reality shows that the hopes of Tunisians went down after the revolution, and those statistics show the depth of the crisis. For example, the brain drain of Tunisia was at a very high level, and the Tunisian brain is a treasure that cannot be evaluated. For example, we have 95,000 people of the qualified people who left Tunisia. The unemployment rate reached 18.7%. It is a very high rate. The education We started to see more than 70,000 students who are dropouts from schools every year and went going down to the streets because there are no partisan or political or sports or clubs that accommodate those people, so they are going to this street. We have 16,000 divorce cases in the courts every year in Tunisia, as well as the deviation or the moral deviation of the people. All of these points are indicators of the crisis. Now, who is responsible for that? The people in general, of course, will hold those in the public sphere accountable, regardless of the details. They why they don't get to the details? Because, for example, they don't care about the share of Nidat Tunis or the share of Qais Said or Al Nahda movement about this failure. What they care about is the entire picture. Because if we look at the details, we can see that some parties have a larger share of the responsibility or of the burden other than more than other parties. But this is for those who look with the critical eyes, or researchers or academics who look into the experience. Because Al Nahda movement, as Dr. Nuruddin said, they governed for 1 year or 1 year and a half or maximum 2 years, which was 2020, 2012, and 2013, and not the entire of 2013 because there was a coup and Mr. the government of Hamad Jbali resigned, and then another government resigned. But from 2014 to 2019, I was a parliament member. I understand that, but the common people don't understand that because they don't look into the details. The common people will say that the political elites are responsible for that. And one of the issues that led to the rise of the populist movement, we have 4 or 5 factors. First, the incomplete building of the institutions, and this was a very important gap from which the head of the state gets into to get all of the powers of the state, and then he eliminated one of the bodies which was a constitutional body for revising the legality of the laws. That was a very important one about the constitutionality and legality of the laws. And that was the one as a referee, and it was taking the role of the constitutional court temporarily because of the absence of the constitutional court. So eliminating this interim institution allowed the president to get all the powers. Second, the parliamentarian performance that started to appear in the past 2 years in 2020, in 2019 and 2020, which was an image that wasn't that didn't show responsibility or any respect. So this gave a bad impression amongst people, and it showed that people are affiliated with others. And here I would like to say, for example, the achievements that the parliament had in, for example, legislations and other works. If we look into these works objectively, we can find that it was a great achievement and that led to the respect of this institution. But some what of the incidents that took place in the parliament gave the impression to this Tunisian people that this institution is not trustworthy and not respectable, and it affected the prestige of the state and the prestige of the responsibility. So that was another factor for the presence of the popularist movement. In 10 years, we had 9 cabinet heads of cabinets or presidents. It was Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, before that Al-Ghanouchi, another one, then Mr. Hamad al-Jbali, then Ali al-Araid, then Al-Mahdi Jum'a, then Mr. Habib Bouslit, then Shahid Yusuf al-Shah, then Al-Bakhbakh, and Al-Mshishi. So 9 governments, 9 prime ministers in 10 years, and with Every year there was a ministerial reshuffle that goes from an entire cabinet to a very wide shuffle of the government. So that was that led to the performance, or that affected the performance of the state. Of course, people will look at the facilities of the world, of the country, and the performance of the ministries in general. The fourth factor is the lack of the democratic culture of the people. Unfortunately, this was a very important obstacle in the Tunisian political landscape. In Al-Nahda movement, and even the observers from outside were surprised about the high level uh, of the bad language that was in the political discourse. I was a lecturer, and I taught a lot of the elites of, or I studied at the hands of a lot of the political elites in the university, and they told us that the fact or the realities are somewhere else, and the realities are relatives, and that we have there are a white shades of a gray between the black and white. Nevertheless, when we started practicing the political activity, these issues were completely different. The Tunisia after the revolution was a big laboratory to test all of these points that we learned at university, and I found that uh, a lot of those political elites don't believe in democracy when it comes to practice. So when we speak about the exclusion and all of the things that they were, we heard from them, we start to question how they were uh, teaching all of these things and all the values that they were teaching about politics, and we discovered that they were practicing things that were preaching otherwise in their lectures. Then the creation of the populist movement amongst the Tunisians. This movement, in the context of democratic transition, can be summarized at four levels. We can say that no democratic building can survive with the lack of development or economic reform. This is impossible. For example, those who are opposing the coup are the elites in the political life. Some of the political opposition are trying to become or becoming a part of the popularists, because people are looking for the economics and the development, and we will get into that soon because of the indicators that we have. The second or the second level is that no democratic experience can succeed without having a main value, which is the mutual political recognition. We lack that. So we have a political discourse that is charged with exclusionist discourse, and that is shown by the discourse of the president himself, unfortunately. The third level is that the political change alone is not enough. With this political change, there should be a cultural and ideological change. If there is a very good experience in politics, but if there is no uh, a political education about the values of democracy, respecting institutions, respecting diversity and the change, if there is no such culture about respecting the laws and legislations, this will lead to a lot of mistakes. And some of the mistakes that we had in Tunisia is that uh, the performance or the cultural discourse of the political sphere was monopolized by the legal professionals. We have a lot of developed laws in Tunisia, but in practice, the practice is very weak, and sometimes the practice goes against what the laws say. So the reason of so this is lack of the culture. The other level is that the revolution that doesn't bring hope is like as a rose that doesn't have any um, any fruit. So in the message that I read between the two poets, because the French people lost all hope at some point, and that's why they said the revolution relapsed. And they said the Tunisian people lost all hope as well, and that's why we see that maybe the hope was there for a couple of years, and then we started to lose all hope. So there was no economic development, no political rationalization, and no culture that was spread amongst people. So people lost hope. That's why the popularist movement started to rise. What does the popularist movement do in Tunisia? They start to question everything, question the state, question the revolution, question everything, and they started to bring things outside the logic. And they were trying to work outside logic and to be futile. So they started to work on undermining the meaning of the state and undermining this coexistence in its lowest levels. So those popularist movement, they don't listen to anybody. They don't listen to other parties. So because of all these factors, we started to see this problem because of the lack of the or the poor political discourse, and because of the hopelessness of the people, we reach this level. Now, to compare between the democracy and popularist, we can summarize them in 6 or 7 aspects. Democracy is based on the parties that are working together, and whereas popularist is based on the absolute truth, which is owned by the people. In one of these speeches of the president for 16 or 18 minutes, he mentioned people and popularist about 18 times. Every minute he would mention the term people or popularists once or sometimes more than that. So he mentioned that several times. So this is a kind of I'm trying to compare between democracy and popularism. So democracy speaks about the truth, and which means that uh, democracy has a straight road, whereas the popularist people thinks that the reality is fixed and it's owned by the people. Another difference: democracy is based on diversity and differences, whereas popularist is built on polarized confrontations, we and them. And when we talk about the other without a definition, without defining them properly. So this polarization has another aspect other than we and the other, which means that we are the good one, we are the pure one, and the others are the corrupt and the bad people. The other difference or comparison between democracy and popularism is there is a core difference or between the issue of representation. Democracy is built on representation, and the popularism, they say that it is about representation, but popularism always talk about others, about the corrupt people, whereas the democracy don't speak about the corrupt elites unless that was proven through the judicial means. The other difference, or the fourth difference or comparison, popularism target the elites and accuse them with corruption and falsification, and accuse or challenge all the institutions. There was When we speak about the popularism, it means that we have that there is a strong movement that can lead to violence, to fighting, or to conflict. Dr. Mahsen, you have only 3 minutes left. You are over your time with 2 minutes, but I'm giving you 3 minutes more. Some of the negative things from that, which were about destroying all of the political and the cultural heritage of the Tunisians, leading to conflict, to violence, and bringing us to the unknown. Now the prospects of the Tunisian experience. We are in an ambiguous area, and when we are in an ambiguous area, we cannot see ahead a week or less than that. The points that we can get, we can have, for example, the balance of inability. What does that mean? It means that the leadership of the state and the leadership of the coup, they are unable, and but we also are afraid that things will collapse altogether, especially because of the economic problems or crisis and the high prices in the market. So we are trying with our partners, and I am concluding with this. We are trying with all of those who believe in the democratic process to believe in uh, the feasibility of going back to the democratic track, not to the parliament. Maybe the parliament will not work or function appropriately now. It's not what we are calling for. Tunisia drafted away from the democratic track, and we don't know where that will lead us. Thank you very much for this invitation and for letting speak to you. And I'm sorry if I was too fast or I didn't speak a lot about some details. I would like to thank SIGA once again, and thank you for the organizers for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Mohsen, for your presentation. Dr. Mohsen talked initially he started with some preliminary remarks, which he said are regarding some features of democratic transitions, which is fluctuation, experimentation, and looking for new starts. And in the case of Tunisia, we can add the element of surprise as well, and that this caused lots of stumbling blocks in economic and political terms, and we could summarize the Tunisian experience being a political breakthrough that is fragile, though. And he said that the populist movement started after 10 years of the French Revolution, and it was the same with the Tunisian Revolution, and it is something that happens when people are frustrated with the gap between the expectations and the actual achievements, and that this was the point of entry for the populist movement to relapse and go back to the pre-revolution status. There were many indicators in the Tunisian situation that caused and led to the rise of populism because of the desperation, disappointment, and frustration, and the brain drain. More than 95,000 people, qualified people, left Tunisia. The high unemployment rates, the increase of crimes, 16,000 cases of divorce annually, which is unprecedented in Tunisia. And under all of those conditions, people lay the responsibility on those in charge, regardless whether they are really responsible for these or not. Most people would not scrutinize the details, but would lay the responsibility on Al-Nahda, although Al-Nahda was not totally in control since 2013. And it was through this loophole that the current president came to power, which is the loophole in the constitution, as well as the weak parliamentarian performance, which wasted the respect of democratic institutions. The other issue is the presence of multiple successive governments, 9 governments within 10 years, which destabilized or caused destabilization in the government, particularly affecting the service provision to citizens. The other issue was the weakness of the culture of democracy among the elite and the lack of respect for pluralism. And this experience in Tunisia proved that this culture was very weak in Tunisia. There are a number of indications in this experience. One that a democratic structure cannot continue without developmental and economic progression, and it also cannot progress without mutual recognition. And because with the current president, we see an exclusive discourse. A third, also political change alone is not enough. We need cultural and social transformation. We, instead of the because of the absence of the cultural discourse as well, and also the revolution that does not hold hope is like a flower without honey,
والتعايش في
a
حدود
nectar, which causes a lot of desperation and disappointment among the grassroots because the revolution failed to solve their problems. At the end of the day, he said that democracy is recognition of the other and to share with the other, while populism depends on monopolizing the truth and polarizing the sides. And there is the democratic mentality, pluralist mentality, and there is the populist, extremist, or polarized, mentality. The populist mentality is based on the dichotomy in us versus them, while democracy is based on representation, while in populism we have accusations against others, particularly against the elites, to divide the people and monopolize power and open the future to unknown scenarios. And he finally talked about political actors, saying that the situation is about to collapse, particularly in economic terms, and that the movement is working with democratic actors to go back to the democratic track, not necessarily the parliamentarian system, because the alternative is the unknown. Thank you for this presentation. We have Dr. Rida Al-Saidi, who is going to talk about the economic and development track. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. At the beginning, I thank SIGA for this opportunity. I thank Dr. Sami Al-Aryan for coordinating this symposium to evaluate the experience of Al-Nahda in governance and in political participation. There are many ideas and issues that have been discussed by the speakers who spoke before me. I have some comments, but within or through my presentation, I'm going to hint at some of those, because we are undertaking an evaluation process which necessitates an objective scientific approach that uses statistics, particularly that the paper that I have drafted as requested by SIGA is regarding the Nahda experience in economic and development processes and how they responded to social and economic demands in governance, whether when they led the government twice for 2 years or when they were partial contributors to other governments until the coup. After that, also there are some assessments based on economic indicators that not only as we are using academic approaches, we have to use those indicators, not only the general disposition or public opinion. So our assessment has to differentiate between the actual outcomes that are documented and the general impressions that are affected by media and mobilization. And also all the to talk about the revolution as a homogeneous being is also in itself problematic, because as you mentioned, there are 9 governments over the past 10 years. So we have a change of the government and a change of the head of the government in depth, and each experience has its own outcomes. Also, we have to assess or to refer to the assessment of international organizations, because in economic and financial terms, we have those international assessments which would help us understand the context better and reach at better conclusions that are more or less objectives and closer to the truth. My paper tackled some of the essential questions, particularly in relation to the the principles of economic development in the vision of An-Nahda and its approach in socio-economic development and the most important achievements. And then I reached to some conclusions and lessons learned from this experience. The time would not allow me to elaborate on all the aspects or the sections in this paper, but I will go over certain important highlights. As some speakers before me mentioned, that there is a general agreement that the Tunisian revolution has been successful in achieving significant progress in democratic construction, but there is a failure in the ultimate result for different reasons and by different actors who took power in the successive governments, be it An-Nahda, be it Nida Tunis, or other political parties, whether in alliance with An-Nahda or in other governments. Was An-Nahda, this is one of the important questions that we try to answer, was it ready to take power after revolution? How did it approach this? Particularly that we are focusing on the management of socio-economic issues. Hello, did you say something? No, go ahead, please. Particularly that its electoral program was based on socio-economic vision. What tools did it use? And also what were the givens of the new context in the post-revolution Tunisia, particularly with the other representatives in the government, and also what were the problems with the general judgments of this experience that judge it as an utter failure in socioeconomic terms. We are going to focus particularly on the tripartite government, because it sort of represents the experience of Al-Nahda because of its broad participation in many ministries and supervision thereof, and also in the leadership of the state, since the center moved to Al-Qasaba instead of Al-Qartaj. And also there was a lot of participation by Al-Nahda through its constant majority in the legislative body and in the uh, constituent assembly, and then in the parliament, as owning the majority parliamentary bloc. So this amount of representation, this level of representation, entails a certain level of responsibility. So there were also some mistakes in probably selecting who supervises the implementation of those policies, particularly in the government. First of all, I have to highlight the economic vision of the movement. When it took the government, it wasn't completely crystallized. There were some contributions by some theorists in the movement, but there was no detailed outline or scheme or an agreed program in socioeconomic terms. So in 2009, there was a dialogue before the revolution, a comprehensive dialogue in Al-Nahda movement based on evaluation and an attempt to draw up future horizons for the movement after its long plight for 2 decades. And one of the papers prepared at the time was in with regard to the socio-economic development and financial development, and by offering some suggestions and proposals upon which the experience was based it when it uh, took part in the elections of 2011 and became part of the government. But when the Al-Nahda became part of the government, they used an approach based on political realism and pragmatism, and a phased program. Although the lion's share was for Al-Nahda, but it was in partnership with other political actors. I will not go over the main highlights and terms of reference of this economic program, and talking about the role of the state and the option of developmental economy, which uses the social market economy and solidarity based market economy, and providing proposals in terms of social justice and the role of the private sector in development. There were there was a set of principles and ideas upon which Al-Nahda based its electoral programs and its vision, and later on its work within the government. So naturally, when it took power, as I mentioned, it wasn't completely prepared. It had a general outline program, but no detailed program for the ministries. Nonetheless, it it started this experience and tried to fulfill the objectives of the revolution in terms of employment, social justice, etc., particularly in cooperation with two center parties, a secularist party who uh, allied with Al-Nahda and started a joint program in socio-economic development, achieving certain results, but also some setbacks, many of which were related to the condition and the context within which the government took power, when we had a relapse in economic growth and an increase in employment rate, which was over 18%. And now we have a similar situation with an increase in unemployment rate and to an unprecedented percentage after the coup. All of this made the government make it a priority to try to control general financial balances and to give priority to base its work on its vision on a go and stop sort of policy by defining 2 years to move from go to stop within 3 years, while private sector investors were reluctant, particularly in the context in the post-revolution, because of the lack of clarity about the future. So the state had to follow that approach, the so-called go and stop approach, after which the investors were supposed to restore and regain their trust in economy and in the state, and the state the economic cycle would resume its natural path. We also have the increasing challenges in terms of economy and labor, with the many strikes and set-ins and the assassinations and terrorist attacks. Nonetheless, the highest rate from 2011 to 2021 was the growth in 2012, which is a 4% economic growth, despite the social and economic crisis. Sorry, it was 3%, and it was the highest percentage over the past 10 years. Why I'm mentioning this? Because to talk about it as in general would obscure those details, and would also obscure the fact that the level of the debt and the budget were much better, and the achievement of progress and the generation of more than 10,000 job opportunity through foreign investment, and also some achievements in terms of infrastructure, which continued for years, and rural development, as in addition to other achievements. Of course, there are many details in the paper in terms of industry, manufacturing, and many other prizes and other social policies, and establishing so-called social housing programs. All of those achievements were done over a short period of time, and we have to acknowledge that there was weakness in economic terms, and also in the marketing of such and publicity of such achievements. Even at the time of the Troika and the joint meetings with the social actors and labor unions, etc., trade unions, etc., were making progress, but the upheaval put an end to it. And I believe many political actors believe that had this track proceeded, many further achievements would have been accomplished in the years following 2013. Of course, the Al-Nahda was not part of Mahdi Jum'a's government, which was a technocratic government, and then we had then it participated in the government of 2015 with one minister, and then it had two ministers. And so this
تفضل أكمل.
go ahead. This path was progressing, and also under Yusuf Shah, the participation and the contribution of the movement was better and improved. Some of the performance was negative and some was positive, and I will mention this in the conclusions. There was also a parliamentarian activity in financial and economic terms that has to be recognized, whether after 2014 and also after 2019, after the elections therein, and also particularly, this is particularly in the issuance of economic laws. It has to be mentioned that Al-Nahda, when it took power, it wasn't ready, but it tried to introduce a new pattern and a new model in public affairs based on governance and public consultation, despite the challenging context. And there was also, it was also keen on involving the state framework and institutions, and also it opened channels of communication with international organizations and donors. And for the first time, we had Davos session in Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, under the Troika, and also in the provisional as well as the new constitution, Al-Qasaba, which is the cabinet, became the center of power rather than Qirtaja, the presidency. So this helped establish a sort of balanced control over the performance of the government. And then this experience was successful, but we had some weaknesses in control and inspection. And in 2012 and 2013, we had unprecedented figures in some economic indicators. And this data, I am trying to get the exact figures and to verify through the formal official documentation in order to highlight the importance of the role of Al-Nahda in those outcomes. There was also reconciliation with the state structures and institutions, and the contribution with partners in maintaining the values of the state and improving public performance and the development of public institutions. In this paper, I also added some details about those achievements, whether with regards to investment, subsidy, the private sector incentives, and also the investment in renewable energy, and also by starting with 3 new public banks. All of those may be seen in part as part of improving the general economic and financial performance, but surely some of it had impact on the day-to-day life of citizens, meaning that it would have yielded fruit if it had the chance. You have 4 more minutes. According to my timing, I have 4 minutes 40 seconds actually, but I still need 7 to 8 minutes. I have 1.5 pages to go. So what I was trying to say is that one of the conclusions is that Al-Nahda movement, when it participated in the government, it took power in 2011 without preparation and with a general vision, without detailed programs for each ministry, and also without special preparedness in terms of human resources and qualified and trained human resources, and this was part of the exclusion that the movement suffered from during decades of autocratic rule. This is one of the things we have to take into consideration when we assess this experience. When we started to assess this, we found it hard to find people who are in support of those detailed technical programs. And also, I personally believe that Al-Nahda movement was not qualified or was not prepared to supervise these programs from the center. Maybe it would have acted better from a better position in the government rather than the center or the top power. So when Al-Nahda headed the government, it faced many obstacles, and it faced much ideological polarization, as well as hostile media, and had administrative obstacles, increasing strikes and sit-ins. All of this have to be taken. It has to be taken into consideration when assessing this experience. I also believe that Al-Nahda supervised the government but did not really rule, and its allies made better use than Al-Nahda itself of power. And we had the failures, for example, of Yusuf al-Shahid government. When people talk about it now, they talk about the failure of Al-Nahda rather than that Tunis or Tahya Tunis or Yusuf al-Shahid. They generalize, and I believe also there was a failure from the part of Al-Nahda in the selection of people in charge of certain ministries. So very often those selection processes were not based on competence and qualification and experience. The same also to giving importance to specialized agencies within Al-Nahda, and listening to those technocratic agencies in terms of assessing the policies. It should have been the reference for the movement. And also we had the avoidance of any evaluation for the government at the time, although there were many demands to that effect at the time in order to have choices and decisions that are rational and objective. I also believe that the failure was by some representatives of Al-Nahda in dealing with certain actors, particularly the Tunisian labor union, causing a crisis of trust. I believe also another faulty decision in the governmental program was to focus on infrastructure and governmental infrastructure, in which we allocated great funds for those basic infrastructures, but they yield fruit after years and not in the year in question. And we should have focused on some smaller enterprises and programs that target certain social categories and citizens more directly, so that those results would help give a better impression about the situation. So, to conclude, the Supreme Committee, although Al-Nahda was the reason for this committee, and it was headed by the head of the government, but the Committee of Anti-Corruption, but it did not achieve good results except for trying to regain confiscated property or funds. and employing these funds in governmental projects. And we also have a general conclusion, which is the failure in international communication battle, so to speak. So, and I believe this is a problem that continues to persist, that we don't have the appropriate communication plan and economic plan. There is all the weakness in terms of marketing the achievements and economic achievements, which were the best at the time over the 10 years, even before the revolution, even at the time of Ben Ali, whether in terms of increase or the economic growth, which was better than the time of Ben Ali, but it wasn't marketed well. So to conclude, I believe that with the losses and failures, as well as the achievements, the Nahda experience is so rich and diverse to be studied in details, and it could have achieved significant achievements had it avoided certain political decisions and alliances. Thank you for listening. Peace be upon you. Thank you so much, Mr. Rida Al-Saidi. You have spoken at the beginning, saying that any evaluation process requires a methodology that is scientific, academic, and objective, and that Nahda experience in economic and development terms is very important, and that it is necessary to acknowledge that it was in power only for 2 years, and later it was a participant to power until the time of the coup. And we have to differentiate between actual results and the impression made by mass media. This experience passed over 9 governments, over 11 or 10 years, and for each government we had its own experience and its own outcomes. And if we seek to consider truth, we not only need to look at local statistics, but also to indicators provided by international organizations. The paper tried to address the essential questions related to economic and developmental plans of Al-Nahda and performance of Al-Nahda, and he mentioned many details. There was an agreement that the movement focused more on the building on democratic and institutional track, and there is a general failure in economic terms. In other words, that the electoral promises and pledges were not met. But was Al-Nahda even prepared to take power after revolution? He says that their vision was based on a general political and economic and socio-economic vision, but we have to look at the context as well. And he talked particularly about the Troika experience, which represents the actual representation of Al-Nahda when Al-Nahda headed the executive branch. And the other question was it wrong for it to take certain alliances? Actually, Al-Nahda was not at the time complete, and it didn't have a detailed program. There was a comprehensive dialogue before the revolution, and one of the papers at the time was regarding the economic question, but it was partial rather than detailed. It used a rationalism and pragmatism, and it also joined ranks with other political parties in the Troika. And the economic approach at the time was the free economy and suggestions to achieve social justice, and also the role of the private sector in development, i.e. the movement had no detailed experience, but it tried to achieve the objectives of the revolution in cooperation with other parties, although they were secular parties, but were part of the revolution, and they achieved better results than any other government that followed. And of course, those indicators reached unprecedented decline after the coup. There was an expansion in public expenditure when the private sector or private investors lacked any trust in the state at the time, particularly with the lack of the stability, particularly when we had those assassinations, political assassinations. But if we look at the indicators, we would find that at the time of El Jibali, we had a 4% growth, which was unprecedented and the highest. And also the public debt was at its lowest, i.e. there were many positive indicators such as providing infrastructure projects, but there was a lot of weakness in marketing and publicizing those achievements. And also the Al-Nahda movement had a minister or two in a couple of governments. However, there were some disadvantages as well. Al-Nahda has introduced a new pattern in public affairs, and it tried to open channels with international organizations and providing courses to its cadres and personnel, and to restore governmental respect, and the center became in the government rather than in the presidency, and they established or they bettered, improved economic performance. So to conclude, he said that the Al-Nahda movement was not prepared to take over power and to lead the economic situation, but it took power to stop the hostile or the rivals, and they supervised but did not really rule or had complete power. And in that context, the allies with Al-Nahda benefited more than Al-Nahda itself. Thus, when people talk about the failure of Al-Shahid, people talk about it as the failure of Al-Nahda, although the presence of Al-Nahda was marginal at the time. And also, there was a problem of selection away from criteria based on competence and experience, and lack of use of think tanks and in decision making, in informing decision making. And also there was a failure in communicating in certain actors, particularly the Tunisian labor union. They focused on big long-term projects rather than smaller enterprises that affect the day-to-day life of daily citizens. So ultimately they failed in economic as well as media term, and the experience of Al-Nahda is very important and is very special and requires much more elaborate study and consideration. Thanks for our three speakers. We will move now to our speakers. We move now to our commentators. We start with, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa sallallahu ala Rasulillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Peace and blessings be upon Prophet Muhammad. I wanted to talk about things that are not usually discussed in the media or in public political affairs, and that are that go deep into Tunisian politics. And I will also talk about the common denominator between the three papers and what they reiterate in their papers, which is that Al-Nahda practiced a reformist approach in a time of revolution, as Tunis started its revolution in January 2011 after a long history of autocracy under Bourguiba and Ben Ali. So their behavior was reformist rather than revolutionary, and it was highly pragmatic. And Mr. Al-Arbawi called it the alliance. I don't believe that was an alliance, but it was a coalition government. I don't believe it reached to the level of an alliance. And also, after El Sipsi, we had a government coalition dictated by political necessities rather than an alliance. Because alliances are based on strategic considerations rather than on the results of or the outcomes of elections. So I believe the Islamic background of Al Nahda, most of the Islamists are more reformists than revolutionary, and they were more faithful to their ideology than to the revolution.
Which means that the focus was on the app performance. And the Tunisians, Islamists, speak about the politics, and they were not talking about economics, and that was one of the problems. The other point that I want to talk about, and that we heard from the three speakers about the depth of the political reality, and here I want to speak about the regional aspect, and that some elites were more prevalent than other elites. So those who were living in the coast, for example, they were controlling the wealth in Tunisia, and whereas the center and the south of the Tunisia were marginalized, and these were the areas of the source of the revolution in Tunisia, and or the rebellions, and even in the beginning of the independence, and they were marginalized. And maybe the legislation attempts tried to give them some importance, and they are the ones that are rich with natural resources like phosphate, oil, and other natural resources, but development there is very weak. The western neighborhood, which is Algeria, the largest or the richest municipalities are the ones with the oil. But for example, Gafsa, Al Qasrain, Sidi Bou Zaid, these provinces are still underdeveloped. So although they are the ones that have the wealth of Tunisia, but because of the elites from the coastal areas are in control of the power, left these areas marginalized. And here the criticism comes. The Nahda movement actually moved in line uh, with those elites, and even the selection of the first prime minister al-Jbali, it was a kind of submission to those elites, and this is one of the mistakes of al-Nahda that were listed in this paper. In addition, the speakers said that the alliances were based on electoral interests alone, and not based on strategic or benefits of the movement. One of the speakers said that the Constitutional Court was not established because if the will was to have a real alliance, the institutions would have been built to protect everybody that from what we have seen in 2021 and the coup against the constitutions. So it was an alliance between the parties and not for the benefit of Tunisia. The third point, the interference in the Tunisian affairs, and even the two sheikhs, Al Ghannouchi and As-Sibsi, they met in Paris, and this country in specific is symbolic, and they allowed other countries to interfere in Tunisia, and that made the space for the Tunisians to maneuver in this landscape very weak. The other point that I want to talk about, I am surprised how a country that lived 6 decades of a presidential system, and even before that, during the Bai's system, it was the system that is built on the head of the state. How can this turn overnight to a parliamentarian system? So there was there was an intention to overcome the parliament. Tunisia was not built as a parliamentarian system, and it was not ready or prepared for that system. So I believe the security and the military are the two forces that are well prepared and the permanent ones. Other ones, they were temporary ones, like the Congress of Al Marzouqi or the Gathering of Al Jafar. And as someone who said that the tree of Sipsi was the tree of democracy that is hiding the forest of tyranny behind that. So it means that you have made alliance with the tyrannical powers in the country. You should have made alliance with the main forces in the country, which are the military and the security forces in the country. And because Tunisia is a presidential system and is not a parliamentarian system, but you should have coexisted with these two forces. In these years, it didn't happen, and that's why the other one selected someone or a representative from the military and the security. And Qais Sayed is just a facade for them because he doesn't have any background, no military or no security, no partisan background. And if he doesn't have that the military support behind them, he wouldn't have made that coup. So I believe that the strategic mistake that Al Nahda made is that it's made a bad option to select the political system, and it was a bad option in the alliances that they were made because it was not political alliances. But the opportunity is still there for Al Nahda movement because it still have the popular support despite what has been being said about it. And the speaker said that it is all of these alliances, it was blamed, but the benefit was for the other parties that made alliance with them. I am afraid, I am surprised with the comparison that you has made. For example, the Islamic alliance with the secular Islamic alliance. You can make comparison with the one that happened in the Morocco or in Turkey, not the one that you made in with Egypt, because there was a Saada and Fadila or the Rafah and Al Adala, that the parties that allied with the Kemalism in Turkey. Bourguiba is considered a student of the Kemalist experience in Turkey. So you should have made comparison with the Turkish experience. Or we can, for example, make comparison with the Algeria or Morocco because they started their experience of the governmental alliances or coalitions since the 1990s. So you should have made use of those experiences and made that comparison with that experience because they had a long time of experience, not with an experience that had a very short period. Now, speaking about the economic aspects, and one of the speakers mentioned that when he said that we failed on the economic and we focused on the long-term strategic projects and we didn't focus on the short-term impact of the project, and that was the success of the Turkish government. They focused on the services from the municipalities on the short term, and Erdogan was the best experience for someone from an Islamic background. He started as a municipality chairman, and the Tunisians should have made the same thing to start from the municipalities, make achievements on the short term, on the short run, but they focused on or bet on the long run, but they failed the short run. And as one of the speakers said, that there was focus on the center, but on the grassroots or on the grounds, there was no such alliance. This alliance was not present in Janduba or Tatwan or any other city. It was only in Tunisia, the capital. So betting on the grassroots through the municipality is very important, and that is still available, especially that Al-Nahda is represented in so many municipalities. So they should start dialogue with the presidency and to step away from the popularist dialogue discourse, because this will be a third collapse or the third setback after the troika and after the one of a Sepsi. So there will be a problem if you don't conduct a dialogue with a Sayyid, especially that this force is related or linked with international and regional powers. So Al-Nahda can make benefits, especially that one of the speakers said that the benefits were personal and not uh, uh, for the groups. So what I'm saying, is there any political center or any center for political studies to make use of that? I believe because of the lack of strategic thinking and no think tanks that are related to the movement, they didn't make informed decisions. I believe we can learn a lot from these issues. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Brice Rabouh. And the second comment to Ms. Jawhara Abdis. She is with us. Go ahead, please. Thank you. Peace be upon you all. I would like to thank SIGA for this opportunity. I would like also to thank the speakers and the commentators before me. In this comment, if I want to be brief or to summarize the point that I want to make, another movement succeeded in postponing the coup against the revolution, but it failed in preventing it altogether. So this is the summary of 10 years of the experience of Al-Nahda movement, whether in leading the democratic transition in Tunisia in the first period of the under the Troika, or contributing to the Tunisian experience. This success to postpone the coup and failing to prevent it altogether goes back to causes that are related to Al-Nahda movement itself. And this was absent from the papers that we listened to. Or sometimes there were some suggesting, implied suggestions, especially of the paper of Saidi, Mr. Suwaidi. At the time of the Troika, I believe what prevented the coup against the revolution or Al-Nahda, despite the closing down the parliament, and I believe what prevented that, some of the socio-economic achievements that Mr. Rida al-Saidi talked about. People felt at the time that there are some achievements or something is changing within the state. The Tunisian people, because there were 10,000 people, they started to reach the first wins of the revolution, or they started to see the achievements with the Troika. Nevertheless, the political pragmatism that the Algerian colleague is complaining us for. This is something that is helping us to read the realities and the forces. It made us avoid the early setback, although it happened now, but at least it postponed it a little bit. The problem, I see it in the how the another movement failed in the economic file. In 14, when the Al-Nahda movement agreed on toppling the government at the time, and this is something that all those within the Al-Nahda movement, they all admit that that was the sin that was conducted by Al-Nahda movement. Why? Because at the time, the politics of Tunisia turned from an attempt to make the political consensus between two parties with differences from Nida Tunis and the Al Nahda movement. This led to this agreement from a political agreement made by necessity to reach political stabilization and to make us quick achievements for the economy of Tunisia. It was turned into the influence of the lobbies of the businesses and political elites, and controlling how cabinets are being formed, reshaped for personal gains. And the personal gain here was for Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi and for the family around him. And at that time, Yusuf al-Shami in Nida Tunis was on the rise, and it was a guarantor for the interest of the family of al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi within Nida Tunis party. Unfortunately, there was that deviation, and that deviation started in the transitional project, and it started to grow as a snowball, and it started to move from a mistake by the coalition to a different mistake. So between 2016 and 2018, when there was a kind of uh, calmness between Al-Sibsi and the other one, there were these issues that can be avoided, and Al-Nahda was more isolated from its popular support.
and its political background through passing the administrative reconciliation law, which was like a deal that Bashi Qaid al-Sibsi through which Sibsi won over the loyalty of the political elite, and Al-Nahda was willing to go along with that. And in 2018, we had another problem, which is the uh, arrogance of Al-Nahda with the results of the municipal election results. So it started to tilt the balance. And there was this alliance between the son of a Sipsi and the Nida Tunis, and this transformed into a conflict. And then Al-Nahda took the side against the son of Qaid al-Sibsi, who was the old alliance. It allied with Yusuf al-Shahid against al-Sibsi. And in that stage, it was even more and more confirmed with every step and with every establishment of a new government between 2016 until today, until Al-Mashishi took over, that the issue of forming one government and after another was not based on socio-economic needs and demands as much as it was based on a chess game between rivals but allies, who look like allies but are actually rivals, like in a chess game in which each party is trying to gain more influence without any real meaning to this political game in economic and developmental terms and social terms. Actually, everybody, all rational people within Al-Nahda and outside it, were flagging out those warning signs that these economic and social relapses and setbacks are going to erode the political achievement, and that this was very important. This was on the political level, and there was this decline in political practice within Al-Nahda movement. It was accompanied with decline in decision making within Al-Nahda. In Troika, despite everything, there were internal balances that prevented a decline when the decision making was not just in the leadership of not only in the leadership of the movement, but on the fifth floor of the headquarters, which is the office of Rashid al-Ghannouchi. Although I wouldn't deny what Mr. Saidi mentioned, because the appointment of ministers was not based on competence all the time, but this deteriorated even more in governments after 2016, until the last government we had before the coup, in which the Al-Nahda participated, which is the government of Al-Fahfah. Those assignments or appointments were based on a criteria of loyalty, not to the thought of the movement or to Al-Nahda, but to the person of Rashid al-Ghannouchi. So the minister who is not loyal to the movement and the institutions of the movements, but he would actually be held to account to the leader of the movement. And if he is satisfied with them, he would obliterate all of his mistakes and errors, and if otherwise his mistakes and errors would be magnified and amplified. So this pattern, the selection of the people representing the movement and constituting the face of the movement, took us back to, or what reflected negatively on the movement itself. I thought you wanted to say something. I have 2 minutes. Yes. The other issue is that this centralization in decision making affected the alliance map with Al-Nahda, because alliance with secular powers was not just dictated by the situation in Egypt, but also in response to the context in Tunisia, because we had the first government that was both secular and Islamist in 2005 under Ben Ali, and the components were almost the same in the Troika. But then this alliance between the two leaders, actually this idea of this term alliance between the two sheikhs or the two leaders reflects the centralization of decision making. And we all know, nobody, and even us today, we don't know what happened between those two leaders, and nobody knows what happened. And no matter how many demands there were within the ranks of Al-Nahda to be more transparent about this alliance with Nida Tunis, and to talk about the structure transparently, but the rejection was not just from Nida Tunis, but also from An-Nahda itself, particularly the leader. So we had Naji Qaid al-Sibsi and his son, and we had Rashid al-Ghannouji and some of his close circles. On the other hand, as though there was a deal
تبعد عنك المتطرفين
between Sibsi
حزب حركة النهضة، وأنا
that
كباجي قيد السبسي سأبعد
go or
المتطرفية من اليسار الاستئصالي داخل نيدا تونس،
further yourself
ولكن
from extremists,
وكان
etc.
يعني
ally with me and
تبادل
Baji
مصالح
Qaid
وتقاطع
Sibsi.
مصالح ما بين عائلتين وليس بين حزبين. أنا أراه هكذا، وأرى أن يعني كيف صار
rather than between two parties even. This is how I see things. And it remained that way until 2000 when the alliance stopped. So, as we mentioned, they had alliances that were informed by temporary considerations, and when they are allies, these allies become the best there is in Tunisian arena, and then things move. So we always shed a disproportionately positive light on our own allies, and this has only given us a legacy of isolation in for An-Nahda in political circles. So despite all the efforts, An-Nahda can find no allies, not even the front of the 18th of October.
لهذا الانقلاب الذي في اعتقادي على عكس
النهضة right now to put an end to this coup, which I believe will continue and expand for no other reason than that because the political class over the past 10 years has undermined itself through those circumstantial alliances instead of building a genuine common ground between different political parties, leaving the floor open for Qais Said for populism. Qais Said is a nobody who was able to take on this populist project. And it's a shame that this person would continue in office for 6 months now. It's a shame for those political actors. It's a shame for all of us. It's a real setback for Tunisian politics and everything we have tried to build over the past 10 years. Thank you so much, Ms. Jawhara. Now we move to comments from some of our friends here. If you want to comment on Zoom, please press the raise hand button to be given your turn. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, peace and blessings be upon Prophet Muhammad. Greetings to all attendees and to SIGA for this important event. This study of Al-Nahda over 3 years, and I would like to thank all 3 days. I would like to thank all the speakers as well. First and foremost, I would like to say that the comment by my sister Jawhara, Ms. Jawhara, requires comment because her comment requires comment, and I am part of Al-Nahda, and I spent time within the ranks of Al-Nahda, and I worked in the political back scene. So I know I am an insider with Al-Nahda. So I believe it's unfair to talk about the leader of Al-Nahda, Rashid al-Ghannouchi, which Dr. Aysam mentioned in his comment about the paper about al-Ghannouchi that he was almost depicted as a prophet. He's not a prophet, but he's probably one of the most capable Islamist figures practicing politics for over half a century. So it is unfair to talk about him as an undemocratic dictator. And we are in an academic symposium. But I would like to tell you a joke at some point when Mr. Rashid al-Ghannouchi was described as a pharaoh, and he actually, Ms. Jawhara herself was selected in the same session to be responsible for the youth file, and he had the choice to not select her, but he said this time the pharaoh is going to be democratic and accept your selection. So more than 60 or 70% of the ministers introduced by al-Nahda were opponents to al-Ghannouchi, particularly Ms. Jawhara and others, and also in the parliament, because they tackled things in terms of governance, and it was much deeper than just rivalry or centralized decision making. After 10 years of the revolution, everybody has to know that the people have chosen An-Nahda, and you in 2019, no one has mentioned that. Even 10 years after the revolution in 2019, people chose the Nahda, but the problem was the choice of the prime minister, which was not based on scientific academic considerations, and it was based on a Shura council in which more than 100 people were gathered. So people selected Nahda after 2014, after the failures and after many setbacks, and they succeeded, and they were given a new chance to rule, but they wasted that chance with the wrong selection of the prime minister and by ignoring technocrats, etc. So also with Dr. he mentioned a very important thing, which is the movement from a 60-year of a centralized presidential autocratic system with a single leader from Bourguiba to Bou Ali, and overnight they found themselves with 218 new parties and the parliament, a hybrid parliament, and lots of political give and take and fluctuation between seculars and Islamists, and much political debate. What I'm trying to say is that the political alliances affected by An-Nahda were not wrong alliances, but maybe the way the An-Nahda approached governance was not completely mature, because Al-Nahda was not totally prepared. It did not have a clear socio-economic program. When I listen to Qais Said he talking about socio-economic challenges, I laugh, but the An-Nahda program or initially was a social as a social movement, but their political practice was as a liberal political power, and their views were mostly liberal rather than social, particularly Mr. Ziad Al-Adari, who later on resigned from An-Nahda, and he is a liberal, and all of those provided by An-Nahda in to rule.
I will conclude with one question. I am a believer in realism in politics. Today, Mr. Mohsen al-Sudani said that we are living in the unknown, and the the balance of the unknown, and that all parties don't know what will happen. Everybody doesn't know what will happen except for the president. Now he is having a plan, and he has elections that we will conduct one day. What is the position of Al Nahda movement today, other than the toppling of the coup and going to the streets? What will happen? Will they participate in the coming referendum? Are they going to participate in the elections if the electoral system was changed? All these questions should be answered by the Nahda movement. And this brings me to the political alliances or the political activity, as Mr. Al-Alawi said. What is the serious political guarantees and activities that Al-Nahda movement can provide for the Tunisians to trust them again to face Qais Said, unless they are receiving the control or the support of the West. The more the West is free, the more they will support Qais Said. So I believe the coming political aspect will be very important, or to accept the current rules of the game. The Qais Said came just as the vendor was surprising Qais Said from within the democracy, and from within the constitution. He is having an autocratic rule, the rule of the single person. So we need to have a roadmap for the coming period.
We have many people asking to comment, but I will give a few commentators the opportunity, and then the speakers would respond. We start with Dr. Ajami, with Ms. Fatma, then Hassan Al-Hassan. Each one of you will have 3 minutes. Thank you so much. The interventions and the presentations were very rich. Despite the disagreements, we need a common joint narrative with the outcome of the past 10 years to build upon it for the next time. And this symposium may contribute to this. I believe that when we talk about Nida Tunis, which won the election in 2014, this, instead of being the first party to support the government and a factor of stabilization, it caused its fragility to the government. And of course, Al-Nahda was a partner to Nida Tunis, and there wasn't a proper alliance, but there was coexistence, and there was limited participation in the government. And if Nida Tunis has taken part or won in the elections and was a partner in the government, particularly that the Al-Baji Sipsi said that if you don't vote for Nida Tunis, you will be voting for Al-Nahda, but the people who gathered around Baji Qaid Sipsi were unable to become a mass movement, and he claimed that he was able to form 4 governments, but his own party split into and fragmented into 6 political groups instead of succeeding to rule. And those who took power from Al-Nahda in 2014 through investment in blood and assassinations, and also in revival of the old system, while trying to go back to governance, not through ballot, and to marginalize Al-Nahda and shrink its role in the political life. Al-Nahda after that, regained its position, and in the parliament, it became the first and biggest party. Then we say that Al-Nahda was taken from the government, but not from governance and from power. And then we had the crisis that reflected on Nida Tunis and their insistence on solving their internal affairs at the expense of power and governance, and they found themselves having to Al-Nahda found itself having to fill in the gap since it was partnered with a party that was suspicious in terms of corruption and being lobby-based and not based on revolutionary and not a reflection of revolutionary will, but a reflection of the old regime. And unfortunately, in 2019, we had no change of that situation. And although we wanted to deeply root the democratic experience, although the all the elections were on up to international standards, but with the electoral system that was in place, it allowed no single party to be stable in power and to fully rule as an outcome of those elections. And with the rise of populism, the country went into a crisis that Jawhara talked about, which is that the populism invested in the gap provided by the absence of other parties, including Al-Nahda. I conclude with a comment.
باعتبارها تدافع عن أطروحة تقريبا هي الأطروحة المقاومة في نظام رئاسي قوي.
And also, we had the alliance of Al-Nahda with other parties, but at the time being, Qais Said, who is not part of the solution, but he is the problem. Actually, he is a threat to the state and to legitimacy and to institutions representing legitimacy, which means that Tunisia is moving in the wrong direction towards a horizon open to all scenarios, and everybody is thinking about how we can overcome and end the coup and move to a new chapter, and how we can build that alternative. And of course, we need to, in the future, to build alliances on a system that is more stable, since the constitution. Sorry, there's a problem with this. The sound is interrupted from the source, so that future legitimate governments are accountable before the parliament. Of course, those discussions will be very essential in the future, and the ideas posed here are very interesting, since the centralized power in the third world makes power become a point of attraction for lobbies and corrupt people, particularly that presidents, unfortunately, do not choose people on competence, but on loyalty and with their own families and relatives. and this makes us probably constitute a threat to democratic experience.
لأنه عندنا أيضا تعقيبات من الأخوة المحاضرين والوقت يمر سريعا.
Please be brief. Thank you so much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. يعني سأبدأ من آخر نقطة من تعقيب.
I will start from the last point from Ms. Jawhara's comment. Jawhara, hello. She's my friend, but I actually have two comments. First of all, the objectivity of our criticism would make it acceptable. So the ideas that may be unacceptable, but to talk about assassination of symbols or figures, I believe we have to be transparent in our criticism as well and our ideas. I'm trying also to comment on the idea of the lack of a communication plan to publicize the achievements, development, etc., which Mr. Rida Saidi mentioned. I actually I agree with him, but is it the job of the party? I believe that when An-Nahda and other parties took power in the state, everything was already in place, including media and communication units. They were fragmented, actually, and they were used to a model of working where there was no planning, no policies, no marketing of projects, etc. And at the end of the day, this is a party that took power in the context of a revolution. It was not ready to take responsibility. It tried to offer its best qualification and some of its representatives were very good, but I believe that there were lots of there was much objectivity in the approach used, but if we try to understand what was happening in the communication plan and then the relation between An-Nahda and the media and the relation in promotion of certain models and certain achievements and by An-Nahda, its ministers, etc., I believe that the party, the movement, was unable to protect its own ministers. It was trying to protect democracy, and it was involved in a political track that it tried not to be victorious and distinctive from the other parties in order to keep and maintain its alliances and its support in the parliament. And also there is the issue of competences and qualifications, which many people talked about. Many of the speakers talked about. I worked on this in two frameworks, which is the level of governance in the movement. I tried, we have to say that there are two things here in this regard. First of all, there is no professionalism in political work. Absolutely. There is always discretion, personal discretion. And there is also no professionalism that can move from 0 to 100%. It's a gradual process. It's an accumulation of experience. We need awareness. We need to establish a culture of professionalism. We were advanced we had progressed and come a long way when the coup took place. So I believe to talk about all the qualified people that Ennahda offered to power was in comparison to those who were sent and given by other parties to power. So we need to be objective here. Failure of the government is one thing, the achievements of ministers of Al-Nahda is another, and their competence is another, and even the way through which they came to power is yet another thing. So when we look overall on this, we will look at Al-Nahda as a political party that deals with governance through much internal dialogue around many issues, particularly dealing with government and governance and power, and that these dialogues seek renewal and revival, and there is no resistance to change.
وكل الملاحظات التي قيلت كانت تؤخذ بعين الاعتبار في محاولة لصنع تمشي
to development and progress. So objectivity also necessitates that to say on the 23rd session of the parliament in which I was member, we said that we should not support Qais Said in presidential elections, nor should we lose our ally in Nida Tunis, because whoever gets the block in the parliament and the majority, because they will have the majority and we will have to work with them, and we will have an alliance to create a parliamentary support to start a new government that can be stable and able to govern and persist. And I believe that Al-Nahda was very much aware and conscious of its responsibility as well as of its failure, and also on of the conditions at the time. So objectivity requires that we be critical, but also we need to be credible and recognize that progress is a gradual process. Now, the last intervention by Mr. Hassan, please be brief so we can conclude. Peace be upon you all. I have two comments here. First of all, the coup came at a very critical moment when Nahda shared in the power over the past 10 years. It aimed at securing the democratic transition and preventing the worst, and they did not actually aim at taking power itself. This is the contribution of Nahda. It was to safeguard against slipping into what is worst. But the coup came at a time when the regional situation and international situation changed in a way that allowed the Nahda to change its approach with the rise of Turkey in the Mediterranean, and also the Libyan progression towards solution. We know that Haftar almost took over Tripoli. They also lifting the siege on Qatar. The Democrats reached power in the US. All of those issues allowed An-Nahda to change its model and to slow down. But it was at that moment that the coup took place. It was very deliberate to stop any possibility of having both sources of legitimacy, the legitimacy of the ballot and the legitimacy of achievement. And I believe, as I said in the morning, that the coup was born dead. And this is no coincidence. It is the result of 10 years of freedom, which increased the level of awareness and consciousness among the grassroots as well as the elites and the we know that security institutions are now told that, or they are said that they are not content, or that the military establishment is not content with Qais Said. These are the fruits of 10 years of freedom, where everybody have been affected and awareness have been raised, have risen. And also, when we talk about Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghannouchi, he was subject to much criticism, very severe criticism, even in the internal circles of Al-Nahda for years, and we haven't seen him excluding his rivals from the central institutions, people to his right and to his left. Most of them are signatories on a petition against his continuance in the leadership of An-Nahda. So when we criticize, we have to look at both parts of the cup, the full and the empty, because that would not know. If we look at the empty half, we will not be criticizing, we will be attacking ourselves. I have my criticisms of Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghannouchi, and I offered a critical paper, particularly criticizing the leadership performance. This is Al-Nahda, and I believe that we have to be just and fair in our judgment of people according to the Holy Quran. So criticism should not be self-destructive, but it should be objective. So the leadership of Mr. Rashid Al-Ghannouchi had its advantages and disadvantages, but he had to strike balances between interests and damages. Thank you so much. Now I give the final floor to speakers. Dr. Al-Ardawi, 4 minutes, please. Thank you so much again, and for all the attendees, and for our commentators. 4 minutes. Okay, I will be selective then. Mr. Idris gave a number of remarks with which I agree totally, which is a reformist attitude at a time of revolution, giving the political approach the upper hand over the economic. So what I'm saying is that what we have presented is related to specific headings, to specific ideas. As we have, if we were told to talk about the revolution at large, not in specific questions, we would have talked about the roles of the different parties, of the alliances, the role. I'm from Al Qasrain, where the revolution started, and we come from strongholds of the revolution. So, so as not to be to take too long, I have some of the remarks and comments and suggestions by Mr. Idris are related to the accusations that their experience is similar to the one in Turkey with Erdogan. Actually, we never denied to use Turkey as a role model, probably, but there were problems related to the different timing and our experience in Tunisia, and this recommendation by Mr. Idris, he says that this movement should also start from the municipalities like Mr. Erdogan. This is not really true or is not supported by the truth, because the rivals of Al-Nahda know this alliance or this relation, moral relation between Erdogan, between Turkey and Nahda party. And we all know that in Turkey, this experience started from the municipalities. But actually, in Tunisia, most municipalities that are run by Nahda members are hindered and challenged very often because of the knowledge of that experience. Mr. Idris also mentioned that Al-Nahda was mistaken in the choice it made in terms of the political program or the political system. I don't believe they were wrong. Most of the experiences we had were presidential systems, but that doesn't mean that the parliamentarian system was not wrong necessarily. First of all, it wasn't a Nahda's choice, but it was a joint choice with other parties as well. And also, this is something I copy from some of the people who support the presidential system, but they say that if Qais Said has achieved something, is that he made people totally hate the presidential system based on the experience they are going through right now. And in terms of the alliances between Al-Nahda and the main parties in power, the army in Tunisia was never a party to rule, and hence there was no alliance between Al-Nahda and the army, but we say that there is no confrontation either. So it wasn't an alliance nor a confrontation with the military. And there were some points in the comment of Ms. Jawhara when we talk about the meeting of Paris and to describe it as a deal, in this negative light. When Tunisia went through the crisis in 2013 and all the other crises, they were either settled through force, or which didn't happen at the time. There was a balance of power between Al-Nahda and the old old guard with Baji Qaid Sibsi, and with this equal power, the institutions were paralyzed, and the Paris meeting, regardless of the details that took place at the time, because regardless of those details, we call it in French, looking for those details, synaptic politique. We believe this is the smaller or minor politics. This is not something we have to go into. It's not about those details in that meeting, but it was about the settlement and compromise that emerged from that meeting that was necessary in order to overcome that tie, because the balance of power allowed no party, whether Al-Baji Qaid Sibsi or Al-Nahda, to overcome the other and resolve the struggle. After the assassinations and after given the context at the time in Tunisia, I would believe that if the balance of power does not resolve the situation, it is usually resolved through compromises, and that's not something that we should be ashamed of. This is what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere. I would say from my own experience that it is unfair that we have to criticize things related to the person of Rashid Al-Ghannouchi, and that the failure is related to the person of Rashid Al-Ghannouchi. And I believe that there were many issues related to the people who worked with the Baji Qaid Sibsi. the main person after Sipsi in 2014 and 2015, who was Mohsen al-Marzouqi, the General Secretary of Nida Tunis, and he refused completely. And Mr. Rashid al-Ghannouchi and we in Al-Nahda sought to expand that alliance, to institutionalize that alliance, and to look at the local level as well. But the rejection was from the side of Mohsen al-Marzouqi, who is an extreme leftist figure. So let's just be clear and accurate about the things we say in terms of judgment. Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Mohsen, please go ahead, but be brief. Thank you so much for all the interaction and the comments. The 2 points that were brought up in terms of my paper in relation to helplessness at the national level. I believe that all parties were unable to push or mobilize the country in any specific direction, and there were many difficulties at the political level, and there was internal political isolation as well as external political isolation and some economic difficulties. So all of those difficulties, even actually electronic consultations, which was the first step in the roadmap, it was an improvised step, and the number of people who engaged in this electronic consultation platform was marginal, no more than 100,000 and 190,000 people. Actually, also the Minister of Statistics gave or submitted their resignation because of the pressure made on them because of this digital or consultation. And we have no trust that because the president at the time said that more than 1 million people went to the street to support him. How can we, and it wasn't true, and he was talking about physical streets. How can we trust the numbers on electronic platforms? So what happened was that the coup has become isolated, and those who refuse the coup were isolated in silos or in islands and did not create a coalition against the coup. And the last point in relation to Nahda's approach to the presidency, we don't in Nahda we don't look at minor details. We refuse the coup as a whole, not with every step and detail, but from in principle, the coup is rejected for a simple reason, because the coup now hits the democratic process with a deadly blow. Actually, it threatens the very structure of the state. So it doesn't really matter what detail exactly sounds illegitimate about the coup. We have no objection to dialogue, of course, as mentioned by one of the commentators. We have never refused common dialogue with the president or with anyone else, but we had no responsiveness from any other side. I thank you once more for your comments. I thank Siga and Dr. Sami Al-Aryan for this symposium and for this event, and God bless you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Mohsen. Now, the last comment from Dr. Rida Saidi.
أشكر كل الإخوة الذين تدخلوا للتعقيب
Thank
على
you, Doctor. I thank all of those who commented on our papers. Some of the remarks I want to make. The comment by Mr. Idris was very important when he talked about the conduct or the behavior of the Nahda, which was reformist at a time of a revolution. Yes, it was reformist at a time of a revolution, and Nahda led the government after a year of the revolution. So the elections happened in October, and they took power in December 2011, and what was available at the time of the revolution was in the Mohammad Rashid al-Ghannouchi and the Qaid al-Sibsi government, where the general mood was revolutionary, one that may accept daring steps and decisions. But after months of the election, this revolutionary momentum declined, and the government faced many obstacles and the challenges in the terms of centralized power and in managing the public affairs. And so we have to so that's why you could call those choices as reformist at a time of revolution. And then we had the troika, where there was polarization between the revolutionary bloc and the central bloc, which was more linked to the old political legacy. The absence of strategic thinking. Yes, it's true that Al-Nahda movement has overlooked this issue and has improvised some initiatives in the movement, particularly through the Studies Center, which included an elite of intellectuals and thinkers in order to strategize their thinking and decision making. And they also started an institution for planning and strategic planning, but it was rather slow. I personally was member to that structure, but the progress was rather slow. The conviction, however, was not based on a simple personal discretion, as mentioned. So it's not really true. So after they established this strategic center, studies center, they continued to use that center for decision making. And of course, the Nahda did make mistakes in terms of how far it took that into its decision-making process. Dr. Fatma, you mentioned, yes, I agree with both. There was the weakness of the economic plan of the Troika as well as of Nahda. Even actually the prime minister at the time they had, who was assigned by the head or the leader of the movement, was not competent at all in the management of economic affairs. And that's why the performance was disastrous. But under Ali Arayed, things improved when we had a competent person and qualified person who was assigned for that purpose and was able to overcome the many crises, economic crises through which Tunisia went. And the final thing in relation to assignment and standards and criteria used for appointment, Dr. Fatma, you may have your critique of the process, but we're talking about the outcomes, and you know very well that I know the details about those appointments, and I talk from actual knowledge rather than just an external judgment or an overall judgment. So Al-Nahda movement, I believe, needs a lot of effort to assess the mistakes and the mistaken choices it made in order to rescue the history of its struggle and the struggle of this movement. Thank you so much for having me in this important symposium. Thank you so much. Peace be upon you. Thank you so much for all of our speakers, Dr. Nuruddin Arbawi, Rida Saidi, and also our commentators, Dr. Idris and Ms. Jawhara. I also thank all those present here with us and also those present over and attending through Zoom. Tomorrow it's going to be the third session at 9 Tunis time. We're going to talk about how they dealt with security institutions. The fourth is going to be in English with 4 or 5 experts on Tunisia, including Monica Marks, Intisar Hleji, and Tahir. We see you tomorrow, inshallah. Peace be upon you.
شكرا. السلام عليكم. في امان الله.